Yeah, thanks for having me here. So nice to see all these faces and all these people who are here. Uh, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about the subject that Mira just explained very well for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that, and then we'll have questions at the end. So if you have any questions, it's a kind of esoteric subject, so hopefully it will be accessible and it'll make sense. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Okay. Okay, so Jewish mysticism in Islamic Persia is the subject today. And Persia, I'm going to use that term interchangeably with Iran and Persia. Slight differences, but for the purposes of today, they can kind of be used the same way. And we will get started. So this is a map of Iran, modern day Iran, also known as Persia, which was at one point much bigger. It included some of the countries to the east and the west. So those will kind of be also included in this talk. So from the early days of Judaism, and like most religions, there's been an inner version, like dimension of the religion, and an outer dimension. The outer dimension being the laws, the traditions, like what you do, what you're supposed to do in the religion. And then there's an inner dimension, which is how it's supposed to feel, what you're supposed to experience in the religion. So mysticism is included in that. That's kind of the direct experience of the divine. Esotericism is included in that. So that's kind of the more magical elements of a religion that most religions at some point have had some version of. Most knowledge of Jewish mysticism is primarily about Kabbalah, especially the type that was popularized in medieval Spain and then later went into the Ottoman Empire and Eastern Europe. This is called Lurianic Kabbalah. It's about 500 years old. And it's now become pretty much, it's in every mainstream kind of Judaism. It's everywhere. If you've ever done a Kabbalah Shabbat service, that's Lurianic. If you've done Lecha Dodi, songs like that, it was written before, but they are part of the Lurianic kind of path. So since Jews have lived in Persia for about 2,000 years longer than that, the question becomes, what did Jews in Persia do before that? Were they mystical at all? Did they have any kind of mystical practice or experience? Or was that only for the Muslims, right? We have a lot of sources about Muslim mysticism in Persia, in the whole Islamic world. This is called Sufism. What about the Jews? Did the Jews have anything like that before Kabbalah came over from Spain and the Ottoman Empire? So first, there is a lot of what we might call esoterica. This is medieval magic and amulets and things like that. We see those in manuscripts. So this is a manuscript on the right, and it has this is Judeo-Persian. It's Persian written in Hebrew letters. And it has on the top, that's a spell for cursing your enemies. And it involves using a cat and some water and these kind of early Kabbalistic word combinations to create like a spell. And then at the bottom, there's also, I just noticed this one this morning. This is for a man who's traveling if he wants to know what his wife is up to back home. It's a spell that you can do to kind of like find out. So there's a lot of that, that's common throughout every culture that exists all over the place. But then there's also mysticism. The notion of mysticism, here's a quote, differs from that of religion in that it does not designate a faith and a practice oriented towards the expectation of an afterlife, but the search for an experience of the divine lived in this life. So what about it? Mysticism, union with God, the idea that God is not separate from us, but that we can become one with God through certain practices. Before Kabbalah came over from Spain, was that just for the Sufis, or were the Jews mystical too? From the beginning of Islam, we find Jewish influence on Sufism and on Islam in general. And we find Sufi influence on Judaism. It's very reciprocal. This influence can be seen in Persia and throughout the Jewish world. And this influence also happens, in addition to happening directly, it also happens indirectly. Part of that just because they lived in the same places for the last 1,500 years. So they're naturally going to kind of influence each other. And they also influence each other through middlemen like mainstream Islam and Kabbalah itself. Kabbalah being all the way over there in Spain, but that was being influenced by Islam and then later came back into the Middle East and re-influenced that kind of that culture and that religion. So we see influences all over the place in all directions, and we're going to look at some of those today in both Persia in particular and throughout the Jewish world. So first, what is Sufism? Sufism is the influential mysticism of the Islamic world. It started right around the same time as Islam, maybe slightly later, depends who you ask. And it really grew after the invasion of Persia. When the Muslims took over the Persian Empire, that's when Sufism really had a surge, and you really see a lot of this mystical, this kind of mystical dimension of Islam being written about and spread throughout the region. This has parallels and connections with other mysticisms. So Neoplatonism, which is kind of the mystical version of ancient Greek religion, Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, and other mystic religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. They all have this same idea about finding union with the divine, finding that oneness, that infinite nature of the universe that we can become one with and not feel like we're separate from. Sufism, however, unlike maybe Buddhism and Hinduism, which have a little bit of polytheism in them, even though ultimately the many gods of those religions all do point to one greater existence, Sufism is very strictly monotheistic. There is definitely only one God in Islam and in Sufism, just like in Judaism, and it focuses on that divine union with God. There are also some Sufi practices that we should talk about. There's a lot of music and poetry. There's a ascetic flavor, which is about kind of giving up worldly wealth and worldly things to get that spiritual experience. Sufi practices were popular in the Middle East and Central Asia. For a time, they're also popular in Islamic Spain and North Africa. And a lot of these practices have either Jewish origins or Jewish parallels. It's hard to know when it happened 1,500 years ago, but there are some big parallels. Not wearing shoes in holy places, the prostration practices that are in Islam in general, something called zikr. Zikr means, it's Arabic for remembrance, and it means remembrance of God's name. So it's the practice of repeating the names of God until you reach like a mystical state. Intellectual dynasties, paraliturgical poetry, that's poetry that's not straight from the holy text. It's not from the Torah or the Quran, but it's from, influenced by that and arranged into new poems. So like Lechadudi, we mentioned, that's a paraliturgical poem. Here's a quote from Paul Fenton, who's a big Sufi Jewish expert. He says, "Upon catching sight today in the synagogues of Tzfat or Jerusalem of the white-clad bearded Kabbalists engrossed in their meditations, one is unavoidably struck by the similarity in appearance with the swaying white-capped Sufis performing the Zikr ritual. In point of fact, the similarity is not only external. Of all forms of mysticism, perhaps an unsuspected and yet remarkable parallelism exists between Islamic and Jewish mysticism." So let's look at some of those early influences that Judaism might have had on Sufism. First of all, on this map, this is the early spread of Islam. Islam started in Mecca and Medina, as we can see right there, in Arabia, and it quickly spread throughout this region. And one of the first places it spread was the now fallen Persian Empire. So that includes Kufa, Esfahan, and that whole region on the map. And that is the same region where the Talmud had just been compiled about 100 years earlier, more than 100 years earlier. So we can look in the Talmud and we can see some similarities with that early Sufism. So in the Talmud, it says, Torah study leads to care and the performance of mitzvot, which leads to cleanliness of the soul, which leads to purity and the elimination of all base desires, which leads to piety, holiness, and the divine spirit. So it's about how doing the external things of a religion leads to that internal mystical experience of God, the divine spirit. And we can see that when we look at the 4 stages of Sufism, which came out just after this. There is the exoteric part of the religion, the outer parts, the actions, which lead to the esoteric experience, which lead to the inner part, which lead to the divine spirit. So it follows the exact same path that we can see laid out in the Talmud just before the beginning of Sufism. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it was influenced by them. What we do know is that the Sufis and the early kind of Talmudic Jews had a lot of overlap in where they lived and what they were doing. So according to Muhammad Shtatu, according to chronological order, it was Judaism that first influenced Sufism during its formation. And he talks about how this happened in Baghdad. It was an fertile ground for the academies of the Geonim. These were the early rabbis it was post-Talmudic, but they were keeping the Talmud alive. And when you look at the experience of people living in Baghdad at the time, you see that there were Sufis growing there, and there were early Talmudic Jews working there and living there. And so there's probably a big overlap there. There's another quote by another author, Mirel Lubet, who talks about how the early Jews living in Baghdad, they came to be known as Hasidim. This is different than the Eastern European Hasidim, but it's kind of a similar idea. These were the Jews who had turned to asceticism, giving up the worldly goods. Their way of life emphasized humility, purity, and trust in God. And they wanted to recover the original spirit of Judaism. So they didn't see this as a new thing being introduced by Islam. They saw it as an old part of Judaism that was that they were now bringing back into Judaism. And this is just like the early Sufis. So they had their contacts. We can see some of their contacts. And we have texts that reveal that the Jews indifferently used the words Sufi and Hasid together. So they used these terms for that we might see as Islamic terms along with what we see as Jewish terms. But at the time, they didn't really have a difference for them. Now we can look into Persia itself and the early Islamic era and see kind of what kind of things we're going to encounter with early mysticism. So in the 700s and 800s, there were some Jewish revolutionaries, and these guys have really interesting stories we won't get into, but there's Abu Isa from Esfahan and Yudgan from Hamadan. These are very Jewish cities even till recently. And they had some sort of mysticism in their teachings that was pre-Kabbalistic. It was non-Kabbalistic. So we can kind of assume, we don't have a lot of their writings left, but we can assume that their teachings were probably influenced by Sufism because that was the kind of way of the time. In the year 981, there's a funeral of a great Sufi leader in the city of Shiraz, also a very Jewish city, and it was attended by Muslims, Christians, and Jews. We actually see this a few times. And so just kind of, it shows that like the Sufis were revered by people of all religions. It wasn't just for Muslims at the time. In the 1100s, we have famous Sufi Muslim poets like Attar and Omar Khayyam. They lived in Khorasan, which is a very Jewish area. And their poems, even 800 or 900 years later, can be seen written in Hebrew characters in Jewish manuscripts. So they were being used as Jewish texts much, much later, hundreds of years later, almost 1,000 years later. Persian Jews were still reading the poems of these people. The same with Rumi and Sadi in the 1200s. Their poems were part of the Jewish Persian canon before Kabbalah even reached Persia. So we see how tied to Persian culture and therefore Sufi culture the Jews of Persia were. Now, Sufism is not monolithic. It's not one thing. So even in some of the poems of Attar and Rumi, the famous Rumi, we even see some kind of anti-Jewish sentiments. There are different explanations for that. Some people say it's because of, just the general attitudes of the time and, who you were writing for. But generally, the Sufis were more accessible to Jews than the more conservative establishment. The place of Jews in Persian Islamic society was very low. So there's stories of Sufi masters who would wear Jewish clothing items as a sign of humility. There's a story of a Sufi who tried to declare how humble he was by paying there was a tax that the Jews and other minorities had to pay. And the Sufi master who was Muslim, he decided that he should pay the tax instead of them because he's trying to signify he's even lower than them. He's even, he's trying to lower himself into humility. So that kind of has some darker implications about the place of Jews in these societies, but it does show the proximity that Sufis maybe had to Jews that other Muslims might not have had. Now, we can look into other parts of the world and see some very cool reciprocal influence between Jews and Sufis. In the 10 and 1100s, there was Bahia ibn Pakuda of Saragossa, Spain. You can see that in the map on the top. And he wrote the first Sufi manual in Muslim Spain. And he wrote it in Judeo-Arabic because he was a Jew. So he wrote it in Hebrew letters. And this manual, it's called Chovot Levavot, still studied today. And it called for an internal dimension that's as important as the external dimension of religion. So the idea that it's not enough to just do the things that Judaism tells us to do. It's about the inner experience of God. In the 11 and 1200s, then we have Abraham ben Maimonides. That's the son of the Rambam, the great Maimonides. And he became the leader of the community in Egypt. And he was actually an explicit Sufi. Like, he started a Sufi group in Egypt. And he brought together the rationalism of his father. His father wrote these kind of rationalistic explanations of God's infinite nature. And he brought that together with the mysticism of Ibn Pakuda from Spain, who had this like inner dimension idea. And he introduced ritual changes in the choreography of Judaism of his time. In some of the solitude practices, he introduced zikr, that remembrance of God with repetition idea that like gives you the mystical experience. And he also found sources for these seemingly Islamic rituals in the Tanakh. So his idea was that he wasn't taking this from the Muslims around him, even though it looked like he was. He was saying that the Muslims actually got this from Judaism originally, and we're just going back to that idea. We can also see some of that in the famed Spanish poets from this era, people like Ibn Gabirol and Abraham ben Ezra, from people who wrote Yedi Nefesh, Lacharudi, all these songs that we now know in mainstream Judaism. A lot of these were heavily influenced by Sufi thought. And if you really look at the words, you see this mystical kind of terminology that the Sufis use being used in Hebrew for Jewish poems. There's also Abraham Abulafia in the 1200s, and he basically wrote about Jewish meditation. And Nimet Sheker, who's a Turkish author, he writes about Abulafia. He says, the esoteric teachings of the Spanish Kabbalists around Rabbi Abraham Abulafia exhibit considerable similarities to the rituals of Muslim mystics. Complicated songs, controlled breathing techniques, and typical head movements. These were all practices that did not exist in Kabbalah before the Middle Ages. Abulafia introduced into Judaism the ecstatic aspects of the Sufi zikr rituals, in which the name of God is repeated so often that one reaches a trance-like state. So let's look at an example. We've gone through some of the history. I want to look at some examples of this. So there's a poem that was written in Spain in that kind of Spanish medieval era where they were taking Sufi thought. And this is a poem by Haim ben Sahel, and it's called Et Dodim Kala. It takes a lot of influence from the Tanakh, specifically from Shir HaShirim, the Song of Solomon, which is a mystical poem. It's really a romantic love poem. If you read it literally, it's very explicitly romantic. But a lot of rabbis have then talked about how it's actually about the love between the people of Israel and God, or it's a metaphor for the love between the soul and God. So we'll see a little bit of that in this poem. So the poem is on the top, we'll see it's just the first stanza. And this is the Hebrew version by Haim ben Sahel, Et Dodim Kala, Boi Lagani, Pacha, Gefen, etc., etc. And basically the garden is this metaphor for the place where the mystic goes to become one with God, maybe that internal place that the mystic goes. And it's about yearning for the beloved and then becoming one with the beloved. There are more stanzas, but if you look at those other stanzas, you really get a sense of God is the beloved, and it's about the soul trying to become one with God. And what's cool is we see multiple levels of influence here, because that's Haim ben Sahel being influenced by Shir HaShirim, but he's also being influenced by those early Sufis of his time in Spain. And then sometime in the next 600 or 700 years, this poem made it all the way to Persia. And we have a version of this poem that was translated or adapted really into a Persian poem by Aminah, who lived in Kashan in the 16 and 1700s. And that's going to be that second paragraph there. And Aminah he actually makes this into a poem it has influence from things like Rumi and Omar Khayyam. It has kind of their poetry style, and it's in Persian. There's Persian and Hebrew letters at the bottom. And some of the themes become even more Sufi than before. So he's taken kind of the influence from many hundreds of years of developing along with Sufism, and he's put them into this. So it goes, Vachte sohbat est bia bebaghem, gol kardenarem bia tafaghem. گذشت زمستان آسوده از غم برخیز محبوبم افزوده شاخم. And the really important part to me is that last line. It says, arise, my beloved, the appendage to my branch. He's referring to his lover as being an appendage to his branch, as being in this flower metaphor, which we talked about in our last class if you were here. He's talking about his lover not being separate from him, but being part of him, an appendage to my branch, not being a different thing, but being actually part of the same thing, and how that kind of bridges that separation that we feel with others. And this is, of course, also a metaphor for the soul's relationship with God. We may often feel like God is separate from us. God is this faraway thing that we need to become closer to. And it's the realization that there is no such thing as closer because we are already part of God. So it's really about opening ourselves up to realize that we are one with God, that we are part of the same thing, that everything's part of the same thing, and we can connect with God that way. So those 700 years in which the Persians had this poem, or however long it took to get to Persia, you see even more Sufi things being kind of read into it and written into it in the adaptations that come up. Now there's another version kind of from the next generation, late 17, early 1800s. It's written by Siman Tov Melamed. We're going to talk about him a lot more later. And this kind of does a different thing with that same poem. So he takes the first line of the poem, keeps it the same, but then he goes into this kind of repetitive verse situation where he goes, Adir lo yanum baruch lo yishan, hine lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. Baruch lo yanum gadol lo yishan, hine lo yanum yishan shomer Yisrael. Dagul lo yanum hadur lo yishan, hine lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. So he's going through the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And each time he's going to a new word and then doing this repetitive chorus that is kind of thematically related to the song that he's now adapting. And he's adapting this very differently than Amina, the previous author. And if we really look at these words that he's changing in this repetitive song, we see things like Baruch, we see Vatik, we see Rachum, we see Chanun. And these are all names of God. These are all known as some of the names of God in Judaism. And so what he's doing, if you remember, what is the Sufi ritual of repeating the names of God and repeating short courses in order to get to a higher mystical level? This is Zekr. It appears that this is at least influenced by the Zekr ritual. And so it's really cool to be able to find these examples of that kind of thinking and that kind of poetry. And so theoretically, this would have probably been sung by a group of people, and most of them are repeating this repeating chorus, and then one person is kind of leading with this these changing words on the right side. Now, let's go back a little bit. We can look at some more earlier poets from Persia. There's Shahin. Shahin is the great verse poet of Persia. He lived in the 12 and 1300s. And he has a lot of Sufi elements in his poetry. So Musaname is his versification into an epic Persian poem about the life of Moses. And he has these really, really mystical bits in there that don't show up in the Torah. If you read the Torah version of this is Moses finding the burning bush, we don't necessarily get this mystical of a version of it. Clearly, he has some influence from his own world. And so we can just read some of this. He says, God says, know that the flames you saw from far away are nothing but pure light. As God's voice was absorbed by Moses' soul's ears. So not by Moses' ears, but by his soul's ears. It's about his soul is being absorbed into God a little bit. Moses replied, here I am, Hineni, and then lost all consciousness of self. He lost that piece of him that thought he was separate from God, and he became one with God. Which is pretty cool. I like this image of Moses being this mystic who is experiencing ego death while seeing the burning bush for the first time. Later, it talks about intoxication. Intoxication is another Sufi metaphor for that kind of when your mental state changes and you reach this holier state. And later, there's a lot more language that's about this. So, upon the way, intense desire for union with the friend. The friend is one of the names of God in Sufism, burned within him. Then, all of a sudden, he saw the world flooded in light. So, Moses is, seeking union with God. This is exactly the kind of Sufi language that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see from Jews in the Middle Ages. And later, Kalim, that's Moses, glanced up from the path, beheld the majesty, and took leave of his senses. That pure man turned entirely into spirit. Being beside himself, he rent the garment of his soul. So he didn't rent his garments. He didn't tear his clothes. His soul was torn. His soul stopped thinking it was separate, and it was rent into something else. A cry arose from the lover now that he suddenly beheld his beloved enter. Again, the lover-beloved metaphor, that's very mystical, very Sufi, and also very Jewish. It's in Kabbalah, it's in Shir HaShirim. So all of this stuff, even though it might seem kind of Islamic, is also very Jewish. So that's Shahim. We go a little bit later in the 1500s. We see that a Zoroastrian Sufi order existed in Persia. So again, Sufism, not just for the Muslims, it's also for the Jews. There's another great Jewish poet, Emrani. Emrani was, when you read his poetry, it's clear he was a very religious Jew. He's probably more religious than Shahim. He's very, very tied to Hebrew and to Jewish rituals and things like that. And yet his son was named Jalal ad-Din Sar Shalom. Sar Shalom is a Hebrew word, kind of very Talmudic. It means Prince of Peace. So that's cool. That was used by Persian Jews. But his first name was Jalal ad-Din. And Jalal ad-Din is the first name of Rumi, the great Muslim poet. So it's really interesting to see that there was this religious Jewish poet who named his son both a Talmudic name and a Sufi appears to be Muslim name. Of course, that doesn't mean he was Muslim. It just, the same way that in America, we might name our kids after American names. But clearly the Sufi world was very tied with the Jewish world at the time. There's also a Persian liturgy, Sidur, that was used before Sephardic Sidurim came to Persia. And it has basically no trace of Kabbalah in it, which makes it very unique. Most Sidurim that people use today are full of Kabbalistic things. The Persian liturgy Sidur is not, but it suggests the wearing of turbans. It has full prostration in it. It has things that show how tied these people were to the Persia of their time. Now, what are some of the differences and similarities between Kabbalah and Sufism? It really depends on the type of each, I guess. But here's a cool quote. The famous Kabbalistic school of Tzfat also seems to have been influenced by Sufism. During the 1500s, when Isaac Luria was active, Tzfat was also a flourishing center of Muslim mysticism. It had a Sufi convent, and there are striking parallels. The Kabbalists held spiritual concerts, which are called bakashot. You can still go to these concerts in Israel and maybe outside of Israel, I'm not sure. Very cool concerts. And at these mystical verses are sung by groups of people, just like the Mevlevi dervishes did, the Sufis. Spiritual brotherhoods were established around a saint, and here too there was the practice of hitbodedut, which is khalwa in Arabic, and zekr, which in Hebrew is hazkara. Zocher is also a Hebrew root. If you know about the idea of yizkor, that's also related to zekr. Shabtai Tzvi, the false messiah who was a big thing in the 1600s, before he converted to Islam, even before he converted to Islam, he took part in zekr rituals with dervishes. And maybe that was kind of what helped him become Muslim in the end, who knows? But it seems like it was at his time pretty normal still for Jews to be interacting with Sufi dervishes. Now, at the same time, in Persia, just a little bit east of the Ottoman Empire, where Shabtai Tzvi was, we have people like Samad Kashani. Samad Kashani was a rabbi from Kashan in Persia. He was maybe forced to convert to Shia Islam, or maybe he did it on his own. We don't really know. Later, he kind of gave that up and became more of a Sufi, and he went traveling throughout the world. He went towards India. He fell in love with a young Hindu boy, and they became lovers and traveled together. And he became a naked, wandering dervish. He gave up clothing and all materialistic items. He wrote a bunch of poems. Him and his lover together translated the Torah into Persian for possibly the first time. And he was also an apostate. He eventually was killed for not fully embracing Islam. He was seen as an apostate to Islam, and he was killed by the Emperor of India. He was beheaded. That's him in the picture on the right. The story goes that he remained alive after he was beheaded and carried his head away. So that's he was very right. This is before Kabbalah came to Persia. If you read his writings and his quotes, it's clear that he knew about Kabbalah. He knew a little bit about Sefirot and the kind of Lurianic Kabbalah, but he was more Sufi. His writings are very in line with Sufism. He had some Sufi friends back in Kashan, famous Sufi mullahs, who actually were some of the people who saved the Jews of Kashan from forced conversion in 1662, right after Samad's death. And there are references in Baba ibn Lutf, who's the major historian of the time, who writes about the Jews as being itinerant dervishes, meditators, mystics, who had a strong opposition to converting to Islam. They were all these things. They were mystics and meditators and everything, while being fully Jewish and not wanting to leave Judaism, even though some of them eventually did, because there was a lot of forced conversion. But we see that all those things were part of Judaism just as much as they were part of any other religion. In 1684, there's a book called Shahzadeh Sufi, written by Elisha ben Shemuel, which is a Jewish version of the life of Siddhartha. Siddhartha is Buddha. So we see obviously some Buddhist influence, another mystical movement that was very popular in Persia before Islam came. Persia was, there are Buddhist statues throughout the region. And what's interesting is that the Buddhist master, I guess he's not Buddhist yet, but the master in the story is called Sufi. Sufi was just a term for a general mystical master. And when you read this story, I read it recently, it's very Jewish, and you don't really get the sense that this Sufi is Buddhist or Muslim. He's really presented as a Jew in a way. So, Sufi seems to have been a very general term. Persian kings at the time who were anti-Jewish were usually also anti-Sufi. If they were pro-Jewish, they were usually pro-Sufi. These were all kind of people who were seen on the fringes of the general Shiite society of the 15 through 1900s. And when we look at the names of Jews from the era, they have really seemingly Sufi names like John Kashmiri, Shahabi Yazdi, Mullah Abul Khair. There was somebody named Ali Shah who in 1797 would write Judeo-Persian poems while living in Punjab. Punjab is in India. India was a big hotbed of Sufism. So there's yet another Indian-Persian Jewish connection. Now, we're going to look at another example. This is the time where we do start seeing some more Kabbalistic poetry start to arise in Persia with the Sefirot and the more Lurianic style, instead of that old school Sufi style. But most Persian Jewish song collections extensively feature more Sufi-oriented authors. So there are names like Shemuel ben Pir Ahmed. Pir is a Sufi term for like a Sufi master. And yet Shemuel ben Pir Ahmed, when you read his poetry, he's very, very Jewish. Like he writes mostly in Hebrew. The content is not Muslim at all. It's very, very Jewish. There's David bar Ma'amin of Esfahan. Ma'amin is from Momin, which is another Sufi term. It means believer. So he's David, the son of a believer. He has a really interesting poem. I'll come back to that actually after talking about the next one. This Hizkiyahu Burjardi, who wrote the poem on the right. And the poem on the right is part of the Eliyahu Hanavi genre of Jewish poetry. You see this outside of Persia too. This one's interesting because it's mostly in Aramaic. And we see this repetition again, right? Every line starts with Ish and every line ends with Eliyahu Hanavi. And we can imagine that there were groups of people sitting in a room, and one person was probably saying that first line and maybe doing an improvisational vocal thing on that line. And the whole group was replying Eliyahu Hanavi. So Ish atimos Allah dalma bochas rachotzane Eliyahu Hanavi. Ish ba'uviza chandu besimane Eliyahu Hanavi. Ish gandart chamta demalkar rugzane Eliyahu Hanavi, etc., etc. But they're probably doing a big kind of singing ritual and trying to become mystically one with God. Now, this type of music still exists among Jewish communities, all Jewish communities. If you know the song Mipiel, there's a short chorus, Mipiel, Mipiel, Yitbarach Yisrael, and the verses are usually sung. I've seen this both in Sephardic places and in Ashkenazi places. The verses are sung in this improvisational way where like each person kind of gets one verse and does a big vocal improvisation, and then everyone comes together for that chorus of Mipiel, Mipiel, Yitbarach Yisrael. David Bar Ma'amin, the second name on that list, he has a version of this song. One of the very early versions of the song, actually, and it's written in Persian language, but with that Hebrew chorus. And what's really interesting is that he has this, so it's this repetitive thing. Very clearly, you would improvise vocally on that verse, and then you would all repeat the chorus together. And instead of being called in the headings, in the manuscripts, instead of being called Shira or Piyut or Pismon or any of these kind of Hebrew terms, it's called something called Kawal. It's called Kawal by David Bar Ma'amin. And Kawal comes from the word in Hebrew and Arabic, kol, which is voice or kol. And it was really exciting for me to see that word there because there's actually today a genre of music called Qawwali music, which is Sufi devotional singing that originated in the Indian subcontinent in the 1200s. And Qawwali songs tend to begin very gently, and they build steadily to a very high energy level in order to induce hypnotic states, both among the musicians and within the audience. They use repetition, so that sounds familiar, short choruses with improvisational verses, again, very familiar, and vocal acrobatics to illustrate the devotional Sufi lyrical content. That really does sound like the way that Mipiel, for example, is still sung today by Jewish communities throughout the world. So I figured I'd show an example of a Sufi Qawwali. This is from Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. He's a Pakistani singer from the kind of 70s and 80s, recent. And we can see sort of maybe what these Qawwalis might have sounded like. He also sings in Persian sometimes. What the Persian Jews might have sounded like singing these songs in Persian and in Hebrew. So we'll do a little bit of that here. Okay, so you can see how there's that repetitive kind of mystical poetry that they're repeating, and then they're all going all together into the chorus. They're doing that improvisational voice that kind of takes you into another realm. At least that's the idea. And another cool connection, you may have noticed that the chorus might have actually sounded familiar. If anybody here knows about Debbie Friedman, she, I believe, took that chorus of Allahu, which means God is. It's part of the God is great phrase. I believe she took that and put it onto it a Hebrew term, Hallelu, which sounds very similar, which means praise God, for her song, for her version of Psalm 150. And I just think that's a cool connection that happened there. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we may see these old Persian Jewish songs sounding like. Here's another example that's actually from the Afghan Jewish community, who are very connected to the Persian Jewish community. This one's a little more recent, and we can see that it has kind of the same setup, the same layout of people, the same style of singing. It's a little bit more simple, but we can see a little bit of that. Okay. Another example, so Sur Mishelo Achalnu, another song that's familiar to a lot of Jewish people and all over the world. This is a Shabbat song that people sing all the time. And the traditional last stanza that some of you maybe have heard goes like this. Yibaneh hamikdash ir Tzion tamale, v'sham nashir shir chadash ubirnana na'ale. Harachaman hanikdash yiparach ve'it'ale al kos yain maleh kebirkat Adonai. Pretty straightforward. Nice little quatrain right there in Hebrew. Now, this song also made it to Persia, but the version that I've seen in Persian manuscripts is really interesting because this is what this is what the traditional one looks like, and this is what the Persian one looks like. It is quite a bit longer, and you can see there's a lot of repetition in it. And basically what they're doing here is turning it into a Kabbalah. They're repeating phrases over and over, presumably to get into a higher state. Now, we don't really have recordings of this. There actually is one, not that high quality recording of it, but it seems like probably this song was sung, and it's the end of the song. So you sung through Tzur Mishalo and then get to the last stanza, and then they really go off on this kind of like heady, repetitive song. So it goes, Yibaneh hamikdash ve'ir Tzion tamaleh, tamaleh hamikdash ve'ir Tzion ta'ader, ta'ader hamikdash ve'ir Tzion tibaneh, tibaneh hamikdash ve'ir Tzion tegadal. And they keep going and they keep going and they keep going until the very end where they go, Tidrom hamikdash ve'ir Tzion timaleh, tamaleh hamikdash ve'ir Tzion tibaneh ve'tichonan, v'sham nashir shir chadash ubirnana shem na'aleh. And then it goes back into the traditional version. But this whole section seems to be like this big buildup of a kind of repetitive song, very similar to what we were listening to earlier. So we can kind of imagine this Hebrew being sung with, one of these songs that we listened to earlier. Can you imagine them doing this? So we're going to move on now to the 17 and 1800s. We're going to talk about Siman Tov Melamed, who was a great rabbi of Persia in that era. We mentioned him earlier. We looked at one of his poems earlier, but we're going to get a little bit more into him. So he was a student of the great Kabbalist from Yazd, Molla or Sharga, and he himself became the rabbi of the city of Mashhad in northeastern Iran. He was a poet. He wrote in Persian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic. So very learned. He knew all these languages. He knew all these Jewish sources. He was a big philosopher. And he was very, very mystical and also an explicit follower of Sufism. His poems are very messianic and very hopeful for the future. He has a masterpiece called Hayat ol-Ruh, Life of the Soul. And I've read some of it, and it's a huge, huge mystical and philosophical treatise that comments on Maimonides' rational explanation of the infinite nature of God, with Bahya ibn Fakuda's exploration of the soul and the inner dimension of Judaism. And Siman Tov Melamed uses terminology that might be surprising to a contemporary reader. He uses the word Taliban, which today is known for the terrorist group, the Taliban, but it really means seekers. It means people who are seeking either the truth or seeking the oneness of God, that mystical experience. So he refers to himself and his students as Taliban, and also as Sadiqan and Zahidan, just other terms that are used among Sufis. He uses Gawal, just like those songs we were just listening to. He refers to himself, or other people even refer to him as Momin, which means believer. So he's often called Siman Tov Momin. His poems are really deeply mystical and Sufi and Jewish and everything. This is a fun one. Just this first line. He says, the greatest scholars declare he is nothing but him. It is appropriate. The lesser scholars say, praise him. It is mournful. And these terms, he is nothing but him, is from La ilaha illallah, which is what Muslims say. And praise him is from, the Psalms, which is hallelujah. And we can actually see in the original, he says Allahu, which is part of la ilaha illallah, but it's, Allahu, and then hallelu. So just like that connection Debbie Friedman made hundreds of years later, Simon Tov Melamed at the time also made this connection between the terms Allahu and hallelu and how they sound similar and how they have similar kind of meanings and similar praises of God. Another one of his poems, again, just very, very mystical, refers, I translated this with it instead of he or she because Persian is a gender neutral language and it kind of works better with that infinite description of God. So it is itself existence. It is the master. It is the living. The existence of its essence is hidden even from itself. It is knowledge. It is understanding. It is goodness. In all goodness, it is the creator, not the created. It is, it will be, it was. That's from Adon Olam. It has not been diminished and it will not be added to. Later, he even says things like, it is existence and the extractor to existence. It is without pair, without partner, without companion. It is worthy by itself. Everything has come into existence and wholeness from its existence. It's just very, very mystical meditation on the infinite nature of something, being God. Like Abraham ben Maimonides, Simon Tov Melamed wrote about how the Sufism he was practicing was originally Jewish before it became Muslim. He was very explicitly Jewish despite being Sufi also. He actually participated in forced disputations against Shia Muslims and against apostate Jews throughout his life. There were people who were opposed to this kind of mysticism being in Judaism. There is like one poem we know of that's basically against Sufism, for Judaism against Sufism from this era. But there are also a few poems that are pro-Sufism among Judaism. There's a quote on the right that's from a missionary who went through Persia in the 1800s. And he talks about how the Persians had Hafez written in Jewish Persian characters. That's another mystical Persian poet. He names a bunch of the rabbis of the time. They all have Mullah next to their names, which is pretty common in Iran. We can see on the top right this picture of people from Yazd in the 1800s. If I just asked you randomly what religion are these people, most people might say that they're Muslim. They are wearing wool, which suggests Sufism. These are actually the rabbis of Yazd at the time. They very much dressed the way that Sufis dressed. They were all kind of part of the same community, at least aesthetically speaking. At least they kind of wore what the people of their region wore, and they were more likely to wear what the Sufis were wearing than what the more conservative Shias were wearing, because the Shias were enforcing that the Jews couldn't wear the same clothes as them, but the Sufis didn't really seem to care very much. And so we see a lot more of that syncretism. Just more quotes about, from this missionary who traveled through that region at the time. He talks about how the Jewish Sufis at Mashhad talked about how they had the exterior religion and the interior religion, that inside-outside version. He talks about how they believe that Ovadia, the prophet, was also a Sufi himself. A lot of cool little things like that there. Now, even in the modern era, there are a lot of sources that refer to Jews being part of Muslim Sufi orders. These are some Jewish Sufis on the left here. This is the Darvish family. Kind of a famous picture of, explicit Sufis. They're wearing the Sufi clothing. They have the Sufi hair. They have the items that the Sufis would carry, these axes. There's like a coconut shell that they would carry. Some of these items associated with Sufis, the Jews are also wearing, and it's kind of part of their culture. After leaving Iran, there was a lot of kind of this mainstreaming of Persian Jews. So when they came to America or when they came to Israel, they, assimilated a little bit more into the outside world, into other types of Judaism. And so a lot of these Sufi practices are either forgotten or they're not noticed as being part of Judaism, or they're associated with Persianness. So for example, if you go to a group of Persian Jews and they're doing a Persian poetry night, they don't really know about the Jewish Persian poems, and they will just read the Muslim Persian poems, but they won't think about it as being Jewish. They won't think about how those were always part of the Jewish experience. They'll think about how this is Persian, and then they'll go and do their Jewish things, which are kind of non-Persian Jewish. But at least historically, aesthetically speaking, Persian Jews were always Sufi to an extent, at least due to thousands of years of contact, kind of in the same way that, Jews in Western Europe, their aesthetics, their synagogues, their music, things like that, resembled the non-Jews that they lived around. You see that in Persian Jews also. They resembled the non-Jews that they lived around. But there is no theological problem between Islam and Judaism. Here's a quote from David Steinberg. As Islam developed, it became by far the major religion closest to Judaism. The most obvious common feature is the statement of the absolute unity of God, which Muslims repeat 5 times each day and Jews at least twice. Probably the only major Islamic belief that Judaism would find unpalatable would be the recognition of Muhammad as the last and greatest of prophets. So there is obviously a difference between Jews and Muslims, but they are relatively compatible religions. Unlike in the West, where Christianity and Greek culture existed in opposition to Judaism, and therefore it's not as easy to kind of adopt their practices to each other. But Arab, Israelite, and Persian culture were relatively similar throughout history, and so they developed alongside each other in this very syncretic way. So musical traditions have continued into many forms of Judaism, not just Persian. So bakashot, nigunim, the kind of wordless songs that the Hasidic Jews sing, ecstatic prayer, those have, there all kinds of Jews use these things today. And Persian continues to be used as the devotional language among Persian Jews. People have noted that the layout of Sephardic synagogues resembles Sufi circles. Persian Jews, and I think also Sephardic Jews, typically instead of moving forward and backward during prayer, they move side to side or even in a kind of turning motion that's reminiscent of dervishes. And there's a strong bond with Persian and Central Asian culture that also is just part of that general culture that they were all a part of. And then they also influenced the West. So there's influence on all kinds of directions. Kabbalah came to the East from Spain, but then these ideas of cleaving to God, ego loss, Hidbodedu, things like that were already prevalent in Persia and the Ottoman Empire because of Sufism. So they all mixed together and they kind of influenced each other. In Eastern Europe, which was part of the Ottoman Empire for a while, as we can see in that map, people like the Baal Shem Tov, who was the great kind of early Hasidic rabbi of Eastern Europe, he actually kept Bahya ben Paguda's Sufi treatise at his bedside and studied it daily. So he was studying Jewish Sufism, which then kind of went into his Hasidic practices. And these Hasidic practices are influenced by that Sufism that was part of Spain and Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, Persia. And those Sufi practices were themselves influenced by Judaism. So it's like all of these are influencing each other in all kinds of directions. So the question becomes then, can a Jew be a Sufi? If all mysticism is kind of the same, if all mysticism is trying to become one with God, then can a Jew be a Sufi, or is Sufi specifically the Muslim form of mysticism and a Jew can only be Kabbalistic? How removed from the Middle East can you be culturally before it starts to just become generalized Western mysticism and no longer Sufism? Is mysticism and Sufism about flavor and aesthetics? To be a Sufi or to be a Jew, do you have to learn the music and the movements and the outfits, the poetry, the language? Or do you have to accept that outward form of the religion? I don't know. I don't really have an answer for this question. How much are Sufism and Judaism aesthetics or philosophies or forms of religion? These all become questions when we're examining that outer nature of religion and the inner nature. But what I can say is that for the Persian Jews, these questions didn't really exist or matter. They were by default a part of Persian culture, which was by default somewhat Sufi, and it was mystical before the rise of Islam. Many of the features of Sufism were originally Jewish, and there was no theological issue. So the Persian Jews probably didn't really think about that difference, except in very rare little moments where we have evidence that they were either pro or anti-Sufism. In the modern era, all of these persecutions and separation from Iran have deteriorated that Jewish Sufi past. But what's interesting is that as Persian Jews assimilate more and more into mainstream Judaism, they will inevitably come back into contact with some of these Sufi practices because these Sufi practices also exist in Sephardic Judaism and Eastern European Hasidic Judaism and Kabbalah in Western culture in general. And so, if you go to a kind of like a Karlabach minyan, for example, you'll see Persians there and they're doing ecstatic nigun type dancing. And it's very similar to what their ancestors used to do in Iran, except it's now Eastern European version of that was influenced by the Sufis, who were influenced by the Jews. So lots of connection in all directions here. And so I'm going to leave you now with a poem by Siman Tov Melamed that he wrote in praise of the Sufis. And this is, maybe it's in praise of the Muslim Sufis, but based on what we know, it seems like it might have also been in praise of the Jewish Sufis. And there's nothing really in this poem that says it would be the Muslim Sufis, right? So it seems to be praising generally the mystics, the people who are trying to become one with God, and saying things like, godly and radiant like roses, the Sufis are, the Sufis, whose carnal soul is dead, doused their desires, the Sufis, right? Their carnal soul is now God, and they've become one with the universe. Drunk with the cup and the soul's sweets, with love of seeing the unseen. Clad in threads, drinking dregs, with their eyes closed and their ears silenced by his absence, are the Sufis, and so on and so forth. This is a translation by Vera Maureen, who's a great scholar, and I recommend the book that she put this poem in. So again, as we can see, Sufism was a huge part of Jewish culture throughout the world, particularly in Persia, as we saw in some of the examples. And this is an early subject. It hasn't been studied so much. So hopefully, as we learn more, we'll find more evidence of this and more to think about to answer those questions from before. So thank you for listening. And I guess we can open it up to questions.
All right. So I saved the questions in a different document, but first I just want to say thank you so much. The comments are going crazy. People are excited and they're happy that you went beyond 145. Yes, someone actually said, this is great. Go longer. Don't stop early. So the first question is about and I'm just going to try to read them exactly as they were written. What era were the Hasidim of Baghdad? Do they have contacts with the Hasidic Ashkenaz people, or were these unrelated movements?
Yeah, so I think they were basically unrelated movements. This term was used in the Gaonic period, so that's post-Talmudic. So it's the early Islamic era. It's like the 7 to 1100s. And then in Egypt, the followers of Abraham ben Maimonides, they also call themselves Hasidim. And then I found that term used in Persia also to refer to the Hasidim, which obviously is not referring to the Eastern European Hasidim. It's referring to the pious ones, these kind of ascetic Jews. So it's a term that was used throughout, but I think it was, I would assume that it was like that term being used in Eastern Europe came from the same idea. So certainly philosophically they were related, and the Eastern Europeans got that, they had the Bahya ben Pakuda manual. And so they were, I think it was very much a similar movement, at least.
Okay, we have another question that is, were Rami and Rambam not opposing at times?
Sorry, were who?
Rami and Rambam. I'm not sure who Rami is.
It might be talking about Rumi.
Yeah, that makes more sense. That checks out.
Yeah. Rumi and Rambam, they weren't.
I don't know if they were like dialogue with each other.
Yeah, they probably didn't really know about each other. Rumi was a little bit later than Rambam, just a little bit. Or maybe they were around the same time. But yeah, Rumi only made it as far west as Turkey, and Rambam only made it as far east as Egypt. We do know that Rambam knew about some of the Persian Jewish rabbis at the time, and he wrote about them, and they kind of wrote about him, and they had a little bit of beef with each other, and they would kind of write about disagreeing with each other's philosophies. And then, of course, Rambam is also one of the most revered rabbis among the Persian Jews throughout history. So it's hard to know. But Rumi and Rambam, I don't think they really interacted.
Someone in the comments also brought up that Maimonides, I think some of his children and grandchildren actually were Sufis, and they were participants in the Egyptian Sufi culture.
Yeah.
Someone asked if they can receive the slides, if I can include it as a follow-up in the email.
Yeah, fine with me.
Okay, great. There was someone who said, I was skimming the last slide. Something was talking about Zoroastrian traditions inspiring Sufi traditions.
Yeah, that's not my expertise, but there's a lot that's written about Zoroastrianism inspiring Islamic traditions in general. And certainly Zoroastrianism had some kind of mystical movement of its own. It interacted with Buddhist mystical movements, which they were kind of in the same area of the world. And so certainly it did influence Islamic mysticism as well. I don't really know the details.
All right. I also just recommended Shai Secunda for anything about Zoroastrianism and Judaism. I don't know about Sufism specifically. Fascinating. Thank you. Can you recommend further reading on this topic?
On this topic, there isn't so much written about it. If you look at Paul Fenton has a lot of he has some articles online and like some lectures and things like that. He's a big Jewish Sufi historian. And I think he's published some of those Abraham ben Maimonides works, so you can find some of those books. So he's pretty good. And then Vera Maureen, she has a book called it is called In Queen Esther's Garden. So in Queen Esther's Garden is a book of Judeo-Persian writings that she has translated into English, and it's available online. Highly, highly recommend it. And she has a little section on Sufism also.
I think this is going to be our final question. Were there markets or some sort of meeting places where Persian Jews, Kabbalists, other people, minorities were making contact, holding discussions? Sort of how was this percolating through society?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know. I would think that there are probably in the markets, in the bazaars and things, they interacted in some way. But I think they generally just lived in the same places, right? They lived in the same world. They would hear each other's music from each other's, holy places. Jews weren't necessarily allowed into mosques, at least in the kind of Safavid period of Persia, so the 1500s onward. But yeah, there were places like, there were eras where the Jews and the Muslims were very much kind of like tied together, and they were able to, interact. Somebody wrote the caravanserais. Yeah, like there were merchants all over the place. The Persian Jews were the merchants who took things across the Silk Road. So they were interacting also with Buddhists all the way in China, and they were interacting with people all the way in Europe. And there's a lot more interaction than we really know about. Sorry, I'm just laughing at some of these Sufi hockey comments. It's kind of funny. Yeah, so probably everywhere is really the answer. In the gyms and the bathhouses and the holy places and on the streets, they all lived in the same place. The same way that here in America, even if you close yourself off to all Western culture, you're still going to imbibe some of Western culture. It's everywhere. It's where we live. So you're going to take in some of it.
Alan, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to everyone in the chat who is interested in further engagement. I really appreciate your expertise and the care with which you've selected these really, really great passages, translations, videos. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. I hope everyone has a fantastic day. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.